Hi, I'm the Space Quest historian, and today we're gonna do something a little different. Today we're gonna sort of trudge through the podcast archives and bring some extra clarity on the soundtrack to Space Quest 3, because I've recently played through Space Quest 3 on this channel. Some of you may have seen that, and I was playing using the MT32, and with the music being all sorts and shades of kick-ass. And back in 2014, that would be 3 years ago, actually back in October of 2014, so that's more or less exactly 3 years ago, I was doing Season 2 of the Space Quest Historian podcast, and I really wanted to get some input on the Space Quest 3 soundtrack, because I was going to do this whole, bit throughout the season where I would play like a music piece from the Space Quest 3 soundtrack, and then I would have the people involved talking about it. So I had Mark Siebert talk about it. I had James Mulvale from Infamous Quests talk about a cover that he did of the entire soundtrack for the remake of Space Quest 3 that they eventually didn't end up doing. And, just sort of on a whim, I thought, wouldn't it be cool if I actually got Bob Siebenberg himself, the drummer from Supertramp that Sierra contracted to work on the soundtrack. He actually composed the entire soundtrack, and just kind of like a pipe dream almost thing. So I wrote Chris Pope, the executive producer, Two Guys from Andromeda wrangler of Space Venture. The Two Guys from Andromeda are doing the Space Venture with this dude, Chris Pope. And he's got, connections and shit. I mean, he works with voice actors in Hollywood, so I just kind of on a whim asked him, is there any way to get in touch with Bob Siebenberg? Because, I want to ask him some questions about Space Quest 3. And lo and behold, he actually not only got me through to Bob Siebenberg, but Bob actually responded back. And since the podcast works in the sort of way that, all these segments from other people were pre-recorded, and I would just sort of mix those in. So it wasn't like a Skype conversation where I was like talking to him. I just sent him some questions via email, and he sent back a huge voice file of just him, talking about the Space Quest 3 soundtrack. And it was so awesome. So I thought, since some people in the comments during my Space Quest 3 playthrough just had some questions, some were like, holy shit, Bob Siebenberg did the soundtrack, and others was like, what in the fuck is a Supertramp, and who is this Bob Siebenberg guy? I thought it would be cool to, go back in the archives and dig up this interview, because otherwise you would have to listen to the entire Season 2 of the fucking podcast to, get all the bits and pieces of this interview. So I thought I'd just, as a courtesy and all that, and just because it's pretty fucking cool, I think, I would just put up the entire unedited voice file from Bob Siebenberg for you to listen to and enjoy. And if there are any, musician types out there who are interested in, computer game music, or if you just, have some technical interest in what it was like to compose music for computer games back in 1989 with the Roland MT32 and such, Bob gives some pretty cool insights into, the process of how he came to make the music for Space Quest 3 and composing for the MT32 and all this jazz. So I'm gonna stop rambling now and just let you listen to the man himself, Bob Siebenberg, the drummer from Supertramp, talk about composing the music for Space Quest 3 all the way back in 1989. Take it away, Sir Bob.
Hello everybody. This is Bob Siebenberg here. I've been asked to answer a couple of questions about the Space Quest 3 soundtrack and project that I wrote the soundtrack for way back when. And it's cool that everybody likes it, and it's cool that it's kind of survived and has a place in soundtrack history for computer games, I guess. So I'm going to tackle a couple questions here that these guys have asked me to take on, and I hope I tell you what you want to know, and that's it, really. I lived in the town that Sierra Online was located in. And I must have been in between tours or something with my band Supertramp, and I can't stay away from music all that long. So I started looking around for something to do. I was working on a solo record, and I was just kind of at an impasse with that a little bit. And I was looking for something new to do, and I saw an ad in a little local paper called the Sierra Star here about Sierra Online. We're looking for composers to come down and work on some of the music. So I thought, well, let's see what that's about. And when I went down and met with one of the guys, he was first really surprised that I lived in this little town. And what they were really looking for was somebody to come in and just revamp a lot of the older music from some of the older, earlier games. They were just on the cutting edge of that technology with, instead of it being blips and blaps, it was going to actually be generated from an MT32, and you could play real sounds. And instead of going back and doing a revamp of the older stuff, they asked me if I'd like to work on something new. And I said, sure. That sounds more like I was really hoping it would be. So I was introduced to Ken Williams and his wife, and to Scott Murphy and Mark Crow. And so I was kind of assigned this project with these two guys who were both kind of pretty left field guys. And they were fun to be around, and they had these cool ideas for this game that was going to introduce this MT32 soundtrack. So, that's how I came across doing the project. And I was a complete amateur. I had never used a computer to write music. It was all 24-track recording. I hadn't really used sequencers. I hadn't really used any of that stuff. Pretty old school guy here at that point. And, they gave me a computer, and they gave me a little set of speakers and a video player that I would take home scenes that were part of the game. And I would sit in my room downstairs and just conjure up what I thought would be something that would be cool to go along with this visual. And I found it really challenging, and I thought it was a lot of fun to do. And the way it would work would be that they would give me this video, and I would go home and do this, and I'd work on it for a couple of days or whatever it took to think that I was pretty close to what might be cool, and take the little disc down to Mark and Scott, and I had a little sync point on it, and I just click on it when I thought it should start, like I had been doing at home. And it was either something that worked for them or it wasn't. And if it worked right away, then cool. We'd move along to the next scene. And if it wasn't hitting the spot for them, then it would be back to the drawing board for me. And I'd go back and try to cook up something else and repeat the process and bring it back down. So, it was pretty straight. It was pretty direct. It was always a little nerve-wracking to walk in with what I thought was cool and end up maybe it wasn't. But it was, the two guys were a blast to be around, and just the Sierra Online facility itself had a lot of nice people in it, and people would kind of jive away with you. So the experience was great to go down there, and I'm proud of the fact that I pulled it off, and that everybody likes it, and that it's stood the test of time. So that's kind of how it all began. And I wasn't a fan of, I was really kind of unaware of computer games and these interactive games and stuff, so I had no experience with what they looked like, what they sounded like, or anything like that. So the title theme music for it, for the Space Quest 3 game, that had been a little piece of music that had been knocking around in my head for quite some time, and quite honestly, I was hoping to use it as part of a song that I was working on for my solo record. I had a little lyric for it, and I had that structure as far as it ended up as you hear it on the game. But there were a couple of other little sections for it that would expand on the theme and the idea that I had just kind of running around in my head, which I just heard, walking around, as you do. And I used to just whistle that melody and figured it out on the keyboard. And that's how I came up with that, where that melody and that structure came from. It was just something that I had been rattling around in my head. So, I had never heard the previous Space Quest music or themes or characters or anything like that. I was totally unaware of any of that. So I wasn't drawn to how it used to be. I was just interested in making what I thought was cool, and luckily the guys involved thought it was pretty cool too. It gave me a chance to use these a lot of these little ditties that that I would play on the keyboard and goof around with in my I had a 24-track studio in my home there, and I was constantly working, and I'd have all these little ditties that would sometimes develop into something and sometimes not. They were just little pieces that I would enjoy, I just kind of thinking them up and recording them, working on them to a certain extent, and maybe they'd go somewhere and maybe they wouldn't. But people seem to like that World of Wonders theme, that it's kind of wacky, which I thought fit that character behind the counter there. And it's got a funny little time signature in it, and when I was working on it, it didn't in my world, kind of. But for the game, I thought that it even added to the goofiness of it, kicking into that little odd time signature there, where it just makes it a little bit dopier or something. I don't know, but it's just fun, really, to look at the screen, play something. It seems to kind of jive, it just sort of looks good, and work away at it. So, luckily I would take it down to the guys, and they would dig it. I remember that particular thing, they just busted out laughing right away. So it was a good sign that everybody was going to kind of like that one. And I didn't put together the final medley at the end. That would have been the work of Mark Siebert, and it was thanks to Mark Siebert really on a lot of this stuff, because I was such a novice at working on the computer that I'd come to a couple of little glitches sometimes where I didn't really understand how this was going to work to be a continuous loop or something, that until you moved away from that page, it would then segue into another piece of music or sound effect or something. And, Mark did all those sound effects and stuff. I just did the actual music. And, it was a nice little collaboration with Mark, and he smoothed out a lot of the rough edges that my material would present to him, I think. to make it work technically inside the program. So, the medley at the end, I think Mark Siebert must have fiddled with that to make it all work in terms of time signatures or, the keys and things like that. So I can't take much credit for that stuff. Mark was a really important part of the way all this sounds and the way it all flows and the way it all works. And, I worked with Mark as a programmer on my solo record. He came up to my studio when I had a producer up and some guys up working with me. And, Mark's a cool guy, and he knows his way around the computer, and he's a great guitar player. And I've lost track of him completely. Last I heard, he was in Seattle still working for Sierra Online. If he's not, I don't know that. So, Mark Siebert was an important character in this. So, it's just a nice thing to have been connected with this project over all these years. We did win the award that year for computer software musical soundtrack or something like that, which is quite an honor. And I think it was a bit of a breakthrough musically, sonically, for some of these games. And, I just see what I see on the TV really now. I don't play games. I hadn't played games before this. I played Space Quest a couple of times after the music was done and after it was done and finished and boxed up, and just to check it out, see how it all worked, and it was cool to hear my music on the thing. But I don't think I've played a minute of a game since, and it's not that I don't think they're cool, because I see them on television, the ads for this, that, or the other, and they look amazing. And I know that even the Space Quest 4 one, which I was originally asked to do the music for as well, when I would get the visuals on Space Quest 4, they were miles ahead of what I was used to on Space Quest 3. And I started working on Space Quest 4, and then we just, the company and I really just kind of got into a little bit of a contractual tussle, and I ended up not doing the game. So there you are. That's kind of my story on my participation in this game. So thanks everybody for being interested, and I've got a new solo record coming out. Punch me up on the computer, and I've got a webpage out there. It's just Siebenberg.com, and there you are. Thanks everyone. Nice to talk with you. Goodbye.